Hello, everyone. Do you hear me well?
Hello.
Hello. Thank you very much for being there, and welcome to everyone. I am Marie, representative from Generation Climate Europe, the largest coalition of youth-led networks on climate and environment in Europe. And we are very excited to welcome you at this second European Parliament Youth Dialogue. So, everyone, the goal of this dialogue is really to openly discuss the future of agriculture and food system with members of European Parliament from different political groups at times where challenges around our agricultural model have never been more important. Future of agriculture is indeed a very hot topic right now, especially with the recent vote by members of European Parliament of the Farm to Fork strategy, the Use strategy to make food production more sustainable. Today's dialogue will focus more specifically on the question of decarbonisation of agriculture, with a focus on the revision of the regulatory framework for agricultural emissions, which are currently reported in two pieces of legislation, the Land Use Change and Forestry and the Effort Sharing Regulation. Thus, the main question of our dialogue will be, how can we decarbonize the agricultural sector? And we will answer it in three parts. First, we will ask a very general question dealing with the policies to put in place for reaching out sustainable agriculture and food system. So really to have a wide discussion about the future of our agricultural model. Secondly, we discuss the two EU policies put in place to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture in this new context of the revision of this law. And thirdly, we will question the carbon storage under this new regulation. To discuss it, we are pleased to host 4 members of European Parliament. Thank you very much for being with us today. First, Mr. Olekas, hello.
Hello.
Hello, thank you very much. You are from the group of Progressist Alliance of Socialists and Democrats. You are a Lithuanian politician, former Minister of National Defense, and you also served as Health Minister. And as a member of European Parliament, you will be shadow rapporteur on both effort sharing regulation and LULUCF regulation. That means that you will very closely follow these two laws for your group. Then
exactly.
we have, for those who don't know what a shadow rapporteur is. Then we have Mr. Petros Kokalis. Hello.
Hello, good evening.
Thank you for being there. So you are a Greek member of the European Parliament. You were elected in 2019 with Syriza, and you are also the Vice President of the Kokalis Foundation, your own foundation, and Secretary General of Organization Earth, an environmental education NGO. Thank you for being there. Then we have Mr. Martin Oisik of Renew Europe. Hello.
Good afternoon, well, early evening.
Yeah, thank you. You are a Slovak activist and environmental expert, and you are also a politician elected as a member of European Parliament with Renew. You worked before on global campaigns with, for example, Greenpeace International, and you are the Chief Program Officer of the animal rights charity For Pause. And finally, we have with us Mr. Ville Ninisto of the group of the Greens and European Free Islands. Hello.
Hello, good evening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ninisto, for being there. You are a Finnish politician, former chairperson of the Green political party in Finland, and you served as a Minister of the Environment. In your group, you will be serving as the shadow rapporteur on LULUCF, so that means that you will closely follow this law for your group. Thank you all for being there. And today we have also with us Fanny Tido, who is our live sketcher and will immortalize this event in our art. So there will be a live sketch along the event that will be filled with your portrait and what are the big take-home message of this event. So thank you very much, Fanny. And now that we have proceeded to the presentation, before going into the discussion, we would like to give a quick contextualization for our audience of the EU Sustainable Agriculture Transition. And Mathieu from the food system team will kickstart this dialogue by introducing current challenges in agriculture and food system. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Mary. Hello to the MEPs. Hello to my friends. Good afternoon, everyone. So as you may know, climate change has become a priority in the political agenda, along with other environmental degradations, such as biodiversity loss. In this setting, the Commission has set an ambitious plan, which is named the European Green Deal. And the goal is first to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of 55% by 2030 compared to the baseline of 2005, and then to become a carbon neutral continent by 2050. So to align with EU policies with the goal for 2030, last summer, the Commission published the Fit for 55 package. Fit for 55 package includes the revisions of two major legislative proposals. We'll be back on all this session. The effort sharing regulation, ESR, and the land use change and forestry, LULUCF. So the ESR, the first one, includes emissions from sectors aggregating more than 55% of EU emissions, while the LULUCF compensates emissions from other sectors by almost 9%. But since 2005, and this is why we are talking about agriculture today, CO2 emissions reductions from agriculture have been stagnating, while non-CO2 emissions have likely progressed. So where do the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture come from? The food system, which includes all the stages from agricultural inputs over farming, processing, retail, consumption, disposal, is the largest contributor to climate change, with almost 30% of greenhouse gas emissions per year, according to the IPCC. So agricultural activities emit three important greenhouse gas emissions. The first one is the carbon dioxide, mainly from poor soil management and land use changes. Then there is the methane, so accounting for 65% of emissions with an impact of 25 times greater than carbon dioxide, mainly from ruminant digestions and inappropriate manure management. And then the third one is the nitrous oxide from excess fertilization of agricultural soils. So here it is all the contextualization we wanted to make before entering to the core of the debates. So intensive agriculture bears responsibility for a significant part of environmental degradation indeed, while sustainable production methods have the characteristics of limiting environmental pressure, ensuring the maintenance and the prosperity of the territories, producing healthy foods and valorizing heritage. So I'm pleased to ask first to Mr. Olgisk, how, Mr. Olgisk, can we transition from intensive agriculture to sustainable agriculture? This is a very broad question. And just to the audience, please do not hesitate to write down your questions in the chat or raise your hand. We will ask it after. So, Mr. Olgisk, the floor is yours, please.
Matthew, I'm not sure that it was me.
Yeah, I'm sorry for the pronunciation.
It is you. I'm used to mispronunciations. I don't take anything.
I'm sorry.
Don't worry about it.
The floor is yours.
How we can transition is it's a very good question, as every politician would start the answer, and that's I think lined up on several pillars. One pillar is that we need to put the money where our mouth is, and that's something which is going to be very, very important. I have to say personally that I'm not very convinced that we are doing it in terms of the current common agriculture policy. I think we need to do definitely more. I am very positive about what we see and the kind of the proposal we saw in the farm to fork, and I think that the farm to fork strategy, which goes beyond just the money, is hopefully going to start paving the way, because the common agriculture policy, so the subsidy system for the European food production, is based on the proposal from the previous commission, and I think doesn't really reflect fully the current, not just political, but also kind of the scientific knowledge vis-a-vis the impact on climate and environment. So we need to start putting our money into not just the good things, not just what we could simply call the green things, helping farmers to substitute hazardous pesticides with safer alternatives and to move to integrated pest management, really help them to support the conversion to organic farming and all the other things. But we need to equally stop funding the bad things. We talking about the impacts of the overconsumption of meat on climate, and yet we use public money to advertise meat consumption. I think this is something which is a super straightforward, simple example of a policy incoherence. Horrible term, but ultimately, for me, logically, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, and at the end, resulting in a waste of public money. Okay. Money that belongs to all of us. So one thing is money. The other thing is practical help to especially smallholder farmers and family farmers. It's about providing them with the advice, providing them with the tools. Third thing is adjusting or modifying our regulatory framework, so actually modifying our laws so we can support the climate and nature-friendly farming more, enable it. Like, it's not easy to get permission and kind of all the permitting done for a biological agent that you use as a pesticide. It's much easier to do it to not submit the data and not to do proper evaluation and keep the old hazardous bee-killing pesticides, so to say, on the market. And this is really crazy situation. So
yeah,
we need to change a lot of things. And sorry, I'll stop there.
Very interesting about how to turn the finance, the subsidies, also the practices. It's very interesting though. And Mr. Kokalis, could you perhaps respond or also answer to how to transition from intensive to sustainable agriculture?
Thank you. I think I'll follow on Martin's footsteps here, because this is really a very big question. And unfortunately, we have proven in the parliament that we didn't put our money where our mouth is, because the Common Agricultural Policy, which was prepared before the Green Deal was put forward as an absolute priority for Europe and the planet. And you might not know that the Common Agricultural Policy is the most solid, oldest, and common European policy. It's a policy we have for many decades, and unlike we don't have one in health, we don't have one in education, but we have in agriculture, and it's very dominant in every country, and it's also the single largest item in the European Union's budget. So when the time came for us in the Agri Committee and in the plenary, after all, we will come soon, I guess, to vote on the new CAP, we failed to input legally binding, let's say, legally binding goals that correspond to the goals of the European Green Deal, specifically in that transition. Nevertheless, we voted the farm to fork strategy as well. And as with everything in this monumental and historic transition towards a greener economy and a greener society, this is going to be a battle of give and take. This is going to go on with fits and starts. There's going to be mistakes. There's going to be wins. There's going to be victories. So the farm to fork is the first time ever in the history of the European Union that anybody gets into the field, let's say, of DG Agri. It's the first time that DG Santé comes out with a policy which recognizes that agriculture is not, as it was up to now, only to ensure the economic well-being of farmers, but it is also the main cause of non-communicable diseases in the European Union, and therefore it's an issue of public health. And of course, we should not forget the EU biodiversity strategy, which is the first time that DG Envy is coming into the fields of DG Agri and is putting up regulations on that. So we are pushing from many fronts. to enable this transition. And in the Common Agricultural Policy, we saw the first major European Green Deal battle, and in many ways we lost it. But I think that with the Farm to Fork, now we have the opportunity to push it, and we have the opportunity to push it. And this is where it also involves you, the listeners, that there is a stipulation in the Common Agricultural Policy that for the first time after many years, there is a greater flexibility to the member states to design their own agricultural policy. So now what is happening in the member states is that the ministries of agriculture are supposed to be doing wide-ranging public consultations to design their national strategic plans for the Common Agricultural Policy, which has a lot of space to assist that transition. When I say we lost the CAP battle, I mean we didn't lose it. We put in minimums. We put 25% minimum obligatory for eco schemes, but it's up to the member states to push them higher if they want. So this is a battle that's now happening on the member states, and I would like to encourage all you listeners, young listeners, to get involved in this dialogue, because these plans will come back to the Commission, and our job, and I think that everybody in this panel is on the same side, is to push the Commission to evaluate these plans with transparency and with the Farm to Fork strategy in mind.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Kokalis, for having dived into a little bit the Farm to Fork strategy and making the linkage with the CAP and the national contributions and determinations. Please, Sir Ninisto, could you develop a little bit more about what's the Farm to Fork strategy and how it is precisely fit for transitioning to a sustainable agriculture, please?
Thank you, and obviously a pleasure for me also to be part of this panel. I think if we are looking at it also not just with our usual European bureaucratic words and our targets and climate goals, if we think about this more ethically and environmentally, what we try to achieve here, we have to remember that the whole basis of our agricultural model is unsustainable. We eat too much meat, we produce too much meat, it's produced in a way where we use too much antibiotics, we use too much fertilizers, and we use too much pesticides that actually actively kills nature. So we have a problem that we have different pesticides still in the market that has a negative effect on a lot of insects and also on pollinators. And that means that if this continues, that we lose the bees in Europe, that will itself create something like a 20% loss of crops, because pollinators are a big part of the ecological way of having growth for plants. So this is what we try to change if we go into the core of it. And the Farm to Fork strategy and the biodiversity strategy, which is the one I have personally worked with in the ENVI committee, they are two sides of the same coin. We try to change the agricultural policy, and then we try to protect nature and increase biodiversity in agricultural land and agricultural areas. And I think this is what we try to achieve. And the big problem is that the strategies are rather good. I think all of our parties are behind the Farm to Fork strategy and the biodiversity strategy, but the CAP reform itself failed. So we don't move money for farmers and landowners to start to use new methods, start to think about more ecological, circular economy ways of producing food. But we have targets that moves them there. But still we have over half of the subsidies in CAP are based on hectare-based subsidies. So then this is what we have to look at now with the national implementation of the Black CAP, that the national plans try to move as much money as possible to more vegetarian-based proteins, that we increase our independence there in production in protein, production of vegetarian products, and that we get rid of pesticides and excess use of fertilizers that also creates a lot of nutrient emissions to waterways. So this is what we try to achieve, but the problem is that some of the subsidies still go the other way.
Sure. Thank you so much, Sir Ninisto, for having underlined this specific point of having ambitious targets, but the wrong trajectory right now with the cap. So very shortly, sorry, Mr. Olekas, we'll have much more time after for talking about the transition, but how precisely now we can shape the EU can shape the cap to make it more sustainable, to make it more green, actually.
Thank you very much. I fully agree with my colleagues what they said previously, and I think we can do not so much with CAP because the CAP is adopted in the parliament, and as Petros mentioned, that we can just follow the strategic plan from the countries, but they prepared for implementation. I think that theory is very good, but implementation is a very important one. And what I would like to add for that, what my colleague said, I think we should change not only the farmers, but we should change our behaviors. But because this is the farmers, yes, they create some problem, but they are not our threats. They also would like to eat very healthy meal and to live in the very sustainable environment. And climate change challenges of climate change and loss of biodiversity are felt very deeply, not only by all of us, but for our farmers. They are the first to feel the impact on climate change or the loss of biodiversity. And talking about the food system and nutrition, I can tell you that good nutrition is essential to good health. But I think that we should not go too far into some extremes. I'm sure the most extreme is not very healthy. And we have to be careful to not give into exotic food trend that have unintended but very damaging effect to local population around the world. We know that if some specific kind of grain or plant become very trendy in the Western world, this demand rise the prices globally, and the local and indigenous population of those countries or continents are not long able to afford something that was their main food for generation. We have to be careful of our effect on the rest of the world also. And if we want the diet that is not only healthy for the consumer, for us, but also good for the climate and environment, we should give more attention to the diets that are based on local products and that we get through short supply chains. That not only gives us access to nutrition that our bodies had over generation developed to need, but also save the planet from the emissions of long delivery roads and help solve the problems of food waste. The shorter supply chain, the less opportunities there are for the food waste to be created. And we now put the forward strategy and goals that aim to make agriculture more climate friendly. But as I said previously, it creates some additional investment for the producers, for our farmers. And if the farmers use less fertilizers, less pesticide, if they leave some of their land for the biodiversity, the yields get smaller. And it's rise the prices. And my question to you, if you are as young our citizens, young people, ready for it, are you willing to pay more for the food you consume to make sure it is more friendly for the climate and for the environment? Because the money from the CAP and the money from the European Union will be not enough to save the same price at the same time. We should be ready to change our behaviors. We should be ready to pay little bit at the beginning, say more for the healthy food. Thank you.
it's a very interesting question. Thank you, all of you, for answering to this first team. We also have questions from the chat, but basically, Mr. Olekas, many young people today are very concerned about their diets. I don't have studies with me right now. I don't have the numbers anymore, but they seem to have willingness to pay in some cases, for example, for animal welfare. Mr. Ninisto, you talk about vegetarian diets, and I have a question in the chat. It's Elena who asks, what are the plans for the livestock sector specifically? And it's a big question today. And so perhaps Mr. Oisik, since you are a member of the intergroup on animal welfare and conservation, you can answer very shortly on this specific question from our chat.
What I'm not sure about is the plans for the change. There are, because it's kind of very, very broad question. That's a bit of the challenge on this. There are some adjustments in the CAP that we will have to discuss how we see the long-term change in the legislation like the LULUCF. But my encouragement to start with is really with I don't like to say it, but with the personal action, not just your own diet, but for example, the availability of vegetarian and vegan food in the canteens in your schools and universities. Please push them to make it happen, and Willem might know more about the details in the CAP. We had the stocking density in the farm to fork, but please, Willem, if you know more. I think you do.
Well, obviously there is also there are two things here: to promote vegetarian diets, but also to increase animal welfare in the livestock business. And there is increased money for that in the CAP. So there is a focus on making sure that the standards are better, that we use less antibiotics, for example, and that the animals have more free room to maneuver. There are still problems there, so I think I would like to see a European level legislation there, for example, on banning for fur farming. This is not food production, but it's also agriculture. I think that's ethically one of the areas which I find unsustainable, that we still have farming of animals in small cages just to get the fur luxury product. So there are these kind of things we have to go through. But when it comes to the transition to vegetarian diets, I think public procurement and government policies are important here. Even in a country like Finland, government still subsidizes merchandising and advertising for meat, and the official nutrition advice is still a bit old-fashioned. So we should try to change those as well, that they support the transition that's happening from the demand side. So young people often want to have the vegetarian diet, so we have to make that in all public procurement. We also invest money into that and invest that there is vegetarian protein available, so that becomes then cheaper, and then it's easier for larger amounts of population to buy it. But the big positive news is that in most EU countries, the big food chains have already taken hold of this transition, and that makes vegetarian-based diets cheaper, because it can't be a financial issue, and then we have to make sure that the proteins and the health balance is there as well, and that is developing really, really fast. 10 years ago, we were in totally different situation. We were based on soya production, but now we have domestic proteins based on peas and these kind of solutions which are more sustainable.
Thank you very much for all your answers. We will now move on to our second team, more about the Fit for 55 package directly and agricultural emission. And for that, I will leave the floor to Michelle, who will present what is the Fit for 55 package exactly.
Thank you, Marie and Mathieu, and also thank you, Mr. Hoisik, Ninisto, Olekas, and Pokalis for all the arguments you already shared with us. So we will now move on to our second topic, the Commission's proposal to revise the effort sharing regulation, also called ESR, and the role that agriculture plays in this. So the agricultural emissions that Mathieu talked about are subject to two regulations. First, the Land Use Change and Forestry, LULUCF regulation, which Marie will talk a bit more about in a moment, and which concerns mostly CO2 emissions from cropland and grassland use. And second, the effort sharing regulation concerning mostly non-CO2 emission reductions. Next to non-CO2 emissions from agriculture, which represent 10% of total EU greenhouse gas emissions, the ESR also regulates emissions from transport, buildings, and non-European trading scheme industries. While it is recognized by the scientific community that agriculture is a crucial sector to reach the EU's climate international commitments, EU policies have failed to reduce emissions from this sector. In its climate target plan, the Commission highlighted that reducing non-CO2 emissions is the most challenging in the agriculture sector. This is illustrated, for instance, by the fact that although more than 100 billion euros were spent on climate spending between 2014 and 2020 from the Common Agricultural Policy, emissions from agriculture did not actually decrease in that same period. The EU Court of Auditors attributed this failure to the absence of both EU and national level emission reduction targets for agriculture. The ESR sets legally binding annual greenhouse gas emission targets for the 2021-2030 period that each member state must reach. However, they are aggregate targets covering all the aforementioned sectors, which means, in other words, that member states can choose to focus their emission reduction efforts on only some sectors to achieve their target. Non-CO2 emission reductions from agriculture have been largely left unaddressed to reach national targets. According to the European Environmental Agency, effort sharing emissions have declined by almost 11% between 2005 and 2018. But agriculture, which is the third largest source of emissions in the ES sectors, contributed only 1% of the emission reductions, while buildings, for instance, contributed for 50%. This means that the Q and climate policy architecture has de facto given agriculture something like a free pass in the fight against climate change. Even worse, member states are not projecting any further significant reduced emission targets by 2030, as they have chosen to focus reduction efforts in other sectors. Consequently, non-CO2 emissions from agriculture have stagnated since 2005 and have even increased in the 2012-2017 period. The Fit for 55 package offers a unique opportunity to change that. So how does the Commission propose to revise the ESR in its Fit for 55 package? Two important things: targets and LULUCF removals. Regarding the target, before Fit for 55, the ESR emission reduction target was 30% by 2030 compared to 2005 levels. The Commission's new proposal increased that target to 40% and also increased national targets in alignment with that. Regarding the use of LULUCF removals, Article 7 of the regulation allows member states to use emission removals from the LULUCF sectors to reach their national ESR targets. The new proposal further introduced a mechanism called additional reserve. This proposed additional reserve would be formed by any unused LULUCF credits at the end of the second compliance period and can be used by member states to comply with the ESR 2030 target. So now it is up to the Parliament to propose amendments and find an agreement on these proposals. Thus, my question to you: does this ESR revision proposal help to make sure that agriculture contributes its fair share to decarbonization? And while we listen to the MEP's responses, just a quick reminder to everyone watching this to please post your questions in the chat or on Facebook. And I would like to ask Mr. Olekas if you would like to start responding to that question.
Okay, thank you very much. Indeed, we have decided to aggressively cut the greenhouse gas emission, aiming for the 55. Now we have the maybe more ambitious 60%, but we achieve this compromise reduction by at the end of this decade before eventually reaching net zero by 2050. And as you mentioned, the European Commission is now planning an EU-wide certification scheme for negative emission coming from agriculture, forestry, and other sources. That will be tabled in 2022. We need to think about the long-term perspective and the integration of carbon removal into our climate policies. Even we succeed at cutting carbon dioxide in accordance with the Paris Agreement, there would still be residual emission. Sucking up carbon dioxide in agriculture soil, it is a significant decarbonization opportunity for Europe. Europe's land mass has the second highest potential in the world for carbon sequestration. And agriculture soil in the EU contains around 14 billion tons of carbon in the topsoil, which is considerably more than 4.4 billion tons in greenhouse gas emitted annually. At the same time, carbon sequestration restores organic matter in soils and regenerates and can boost soil fertility. Therefore, carbon farming has been included among the main good agricultural environment condition of the eco scheme, the new green cap. Also, sustainable posture management has enormous potential for storing carbon in the soil. Carbon sequestration improves soil health, makes soil more resilient to extreme weather events, contributes to climate change mitigation, and can benefit posture quality. Sustainable livestock grazing system can combine animals production with carbon storage, nutrition cycling, and biodiversity. But once again, we need to incentivize farmers to make sure that get sufficient income applied to these schemes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Minister, would you like to potentially add to that, and maybe with a little bit of a focus on the ESR revision and potentially also the sector-based targets that are missing?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, since I'm working on the LULUCF mainly as the rapporteur, I'm looking at also at the ESR from that viewpoint, and I think there is a problem with the effort sharing, that there are too many flexibilities at the moment. I think the proposals, if European Union's climate target would be 70% by 2030, it would be no problem to have flexibilities between the sectors to make sure that the target is achieved in a cost-effective way. But now, when the overall target is as low as 55, not in line with the Paris Agreement's goal of limiting climate warming to 1.5 degrees, these flexibilities only create a situation where any overachievement of the targets will not happen. If there is an additional reserve for LULUCF extra, then that will just reduce emission reductions because member states will use it. So I think Commission has made a wrong turn there by increasing even some of the flexibilities between the sectors. The ESR itself, when it comes to agricultural non-CO2 emissions, so that is the livestock side and the methane emissions. I think for the first time, actually, member states are now starting to act against agricultural emissions because the emission reduction target on effort sharing is high enough. In Finland, it's as high as 50%. So we know that getting traffic to zero emission is one of the most difficult things to do. We have heavy-duty traffic, which is difficult to decarbonize fast. So that means that even countries like Finland, where agricultural lobby is very strong, people still have to realize, okay, we should do things here because it's cost effective. So we have looked, for example, in Finland, ways of reducing use of peatlands and bogs, or revetting those farms and fields, because boglands and peatlands are a source of CO2 emissions to the atmosphere. So the kind of soil and land you use for farming and for livestock does affect a lot. And this has a link to the livestock emissions very closely, because in Finland, these peatlands have often been turned into farmland for livestock uses. They are in the same regions. So we should address these kind of like low-hanging fruits first. And I think for the first time we have action that is climate-based action on agricultural emission reductions. Before this level of ambition we have now, there was no incentive to do that. Nobody has done anything, to be honest. Or if they have, somebody else has emitted somewhere else more. So there hasn't been concerted action.
Yeah, thank you very much for this. Thanks also for insisting on the importance of revetting peatlands that are a super important source of carbon dioxide emissions. And interesting that indeed this is actually one of the low-hanging fruit sectors in Finland. I wasn't aware of that, but that's good news, obviously. Thank you for sharing this. Mr. Kokalis, would you like to respond to that question and potentially add some new elements?
Well, Ville is handling the file, so he's much more of a specialist. But again, I would like to go back to the eco schemes, and We're still waiting to see what the countries come up as eco-schemes, where they can deliver better livestock management techniques, which will address the methane issue, and also on the fertilizer issue about the nitrous oxide gas. So in the effort sharing regulation, it depends on the country. In my country, we don't have bogs, we don't have peatlands. So it's really sometimes really hard to actually measure the agricultural emissions, because really that depends many times on the livestock, on the way that you feed them, and so on. So no, I don't have something very much to add to this part other than that.
That's also fine. Indeed, landscapes are different. So your situation in Greece is not at all like Finland. So I appreciate that. Thanks anyway for sharing your thoughts. And Mr. Heusig, do you have anything to add on that question?
It was quite well described. It's on the low hanging fruits, I think, and Villa was correct to say this. It's actually not only Finland. You have not peatlands, but potential wetlands around. It's also around the Europe that we need to kind of not rewild, but restore. And they are, I believe, compatible with agriculture. This is something which it's interesting, and there's lots of learning possible from different initiatives across the Europe in different ecosystems. And we need to exchange this information, learn from the best practice. We don't do that enough. It sounds obvious, but we don't. The flexibility is, I have to approach it sensitively because we don't have yet formed a position as a group, to be very honest. I'm cautious. I'm very cautious because, because indeed we need to be careful about kind of not trying to the reason lack of action or inaction in the ESR, which we saw so far, and honestly also it's not just the agriculture, there's massive issue with the transport, but that might be, and there's also going to be discussion, taken out of the ESR into a separate ETS, and at the same time really trying to motivate farmers. And I think the motivation and also not support for the best practice are going to be important elements. So we need to be careful when talking about sensitivity, and I'll watch out for it because we cannot pretend that we do something when in reality we don't.
Yeah, thanks for sharing this. Indeed, it's a very, very complicated, intricate topic with many different perspectives to take into consideration, and there's not something as a common ground necessarily everywhere yet. So thanks. And I think, Marie, I would hand it over to you to see if there's any questions in the chat for the MEPs.
Yes, thank you, Michelle, and thank you, everyone, for this very interesting discussion about these two pieces of legislation. We have two questions on the chat that directly concern what we talked about. We have Maria Silvia on LinkedIn who asks, could we have hope in techno-intensive agricultural practices such as vertical farming, highly precise agriculture, re-engineering without being misled? And that's a tricky question about what kind of food system we want. I think, Mr. Kokalis, you have to leave us after this, so perhaps you can take the floor to share your final word and answer to Maria Silva about this question.
Well, this is a very good point, because I think that the agriculture, like Villa said before, it was generally an area that was out of the equation, out of the question. Nobody was talking to agriculture about the CO2 problem and global warming. So agriculture is a low-hanging fruit in terms of technology. Agriculture, especially small farming agriculture, is very technologically backward. It has not moved into the, let's say, the 21st century, and there is tremendous possibilities to use these new technologies effectively in food production, in carbon sequestration, in lowering our emissions, in shortening our supply chains, in providing better food for more people. And I'm a big believer in the innovation potential that can happen in the agricultural sector. I see a lot of startups in the agricultural space, in the food space, to say it better, because there are so many steps throughout the food chain that things can, where we can make advantages in terms of better use of resources, of a smaller ecological footprint. And I think that all these developments taken together, because again, this is not a fight that is going to happen, that we're going to arrive in this space by flipping a switch. It's going to take a lot of fights in many fronts, and the technological innovation, and not only the technological, also the cultural innovation in terms of vertical farming, in terms of urban farming, where highly precise agriculture here is very pertinent, because we lose, for example, in my country, so much water, which we don't really have, in not using it in a way that is more productive. So obviously we can be misled, but I think that this is the space where we need to have faith in and push these technologies better, and make sure that we give access to the farmers, because the big companies, the multinationals, do have access to these technologies, and that's fine, and they should use them, but we should go ahead and deploy the rural broadband to make sure that people in the rural areas have access, and also the digital innovation hubs where people can be trained to use them, and so on. I'm not a believer in this idea that the farmers are some backward people who don't know technology and everything. They all have a smartphone. They're all in Facebook anyway, and I'm sure we can do much more here, and we should not be afraid of this development. And I do have to leave, and I take the opportunity to thank you very much for having me in this conversation, and wish you the best for the rest of the day.
Thank you very much for so now we have just very rapidly another question from Thomas Kola about how to ensure that that the legislation will be well applied. Just perhaps Mr. Olekas, in 30 seconds, 1 minute, what can be done about it?
You're talking about the question about the new technologies and
No, how to make sure that the legislation will be applied, because it's a question that we can ask.
Yeah. I hope so. We will have that discussion, and we will prepare. And I think we will found that compromise which improve the existing project.
Okay. So about monitoring and control. Thank you very much. We will now move to the last theme of our dialogue about carbon sequestration. We already talked a little bit with Mr. Ninisto, who will come back to the dialogue, but it will be the time to really talk more about this subject. So carbon sequestration, what it is, it's that soils have an enormous potential to capture carbon dioxide. And with agriculture that covers more than half of Earth's terrestrial surface, restoring carbon-depleted soil could compensate for the increase in CO2 emission in the atmosphere from fossil fuel combustion. And because of this huge potential to dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions, it was decided that in 10 years, the LULUCF regulation, it will expand to non-CO2 emissions that were previously reported under the other legislation that Michel presented to you, the effort sharing regulation, in order to combine them in one big sector. That will be called the agriculture, forestry, and other land use sector, the AFOLU sector. And the objective is to reach climate neutrality for this AFOLU sector by 2035. But we think that carbon sequestration is a good way to go, but we have some point of attention with it. And indeed, some researchers, as well as environmentalists, question the true potential to reach a carbon neutral agriculture with this method. So first, we identify challenges in assessing carbon storage, since absorption of carbon varies significantly depending on the nature of the soil. So that some claim benefits can be impossible to prove or disprove. And aside from the scientific uncertainties, there's also a challenge to integrate the other aspects of environment, like biodiversity issues, multifunctionality of ecosystem, into this carbon sequestration framework. Because carbon sequestration relies on a very large variety of agricultural practices that are really different from one to another. Some take into account biodiversity, others not. For example, soil conservation agriculture needs the use of glyphosate, a pesticide that can be dangerous for biodiversity, to minimize its impact on the soil. And finally, with the new legislation, we identified a risk with the creation of this AFOLU sector. Mr. Ninisto talked about it earlier, but it's that we question the capacity of this sector to be a compensator for all sector. We fear that it won't provide sufficient incentive for both sectors to reduce emissions rather than, and that one will carry most of the burden. Thus, we consider that removal of greenhouse gas emissions from the agriculture sector need to have its own target, separate from target covering forestry and other land uses. And, in other words, it needs to ensure that there won't be flexibility between the different targets in order to give the right incentive so that efforts keep going on to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the agriculture sector. So to stay below the 1.5 degree, we consider that we need both reduction in emission and removal of carbon dioxide, but be aware of this flexibility, and that's why it's important to ensure that agriculture contributes fairly to the reduction of greenhouse gas emission, but the new legislation raises concern that it won't be the case. So my question to you, misters, is how to ensure that the mechanism of carbon sequestration do not turn into greenwashing, and how to ensure that there is an effective reduction of greenhouse gas emission in the agricultural sector under this new legislation. So, Mr. Ninisto, you talked about it earlier, but perhaps you can go deeper on this matter and explain a little bit more to our audience.
Thank you. Well, I just had a discussion with the commissioner in ENVI committee on forest management practices and biodiversity and climate. So good to continue on these same issues regarding the agricultural emission reduction targets. I think it's very clear that we have to make sure that the accounting and the way we develop these targets is solid, that every country has to do action. And the action has to be solidified with clear data, and it's additional. So we can't announce kind of like greenwashing schemes where you are supposedly offsetting emission reductions by planting trees somewhere. We have to be very sure that the sinks are increasing, and that in farming side, I think we have a lot of possibilities in carbon farming, but we have to make sure that we have quality data where we can base any support and subsidies for carbon farming, and maybe in the long term also kind of like market mechanisms that we have kind of like ETS for increasing sinks. That has to be based on results. So there has to be very clear data on the results that we get with that. I'll let Martin speak fast now if he has to leave.
Yeah, you can have a final word for us, perhaps a take-home message for the young consumers.
I'm not sure it's going to be the final. I'm happy to hand back to you. If you like. Really, it's going to be also about making sure that what, for example, we are counting and sequestered to soils stays there. This is something which is the exactness of the system needs to be really, really well thought through. And for this kind of, I like the Copernicus, I like our satellites. I think that this shouldn't be left up to the member states. We really need to have it independent, and we really need to have it done properly. That's kind of a core element of it all, in my view, that it's really, really exact. And we complement it where, so to say, with the proper motivation systems, but also that we don't have a system where there are kind of some countries not doing anything and other countries having to carry all the burdens. So kind of the effort sharing, when I can use the term, is done in a fair manner. This is going to be also important, I believe, that some country, that everybody at the end of the day is doing not just their share, but the utmost. And thank you very much for the possibility to participate. It was indeed a very interesting and detailed discussion. I like the questions that challenged me. So thank you very much, and have a nice evening.
Mr. And have a good run at Envy. Thank you. I don't know if Mr. Olekas is still there, because he was very optimistic about carbon sequestration, and we could have a discussion, but I think he lost his connection. So perhaps Mr. Ninisto, we will show now the art of our live sketcher to see how it was doing. So Anna, can you show us Fanny's work, please?
So here you can see a bit of what I have been doing during the dialogue. Thank you very much. I'm very glad to hear the different perspectives of our MPs and about food production. I'm gonna put it a little bit faster about farmers, the role of farmers, and we also can see different bridges that they made between each others. So that's very interesting to see that we also all agree, and we all want a more a decarbonized food systems and more sustainable system. So we will for sure share with you the result of the graphic recording. This is also the beginning, so I will make sure at the last point. So really, thank you to all of you. It was a pleasure to listen to you.
Thank you, Fanny, very much for your art that is stunning, and for being there, this dialogue, and to really capture and immortalize it. It's an absolute, it's so great. Thank you very much. Thank you to every MEPs who were there. So much of them have to leave earlier because they're also at the moment an ENVI committee, and they have to leave to come back. So thank you for being there, even if there was this ENVI committee. Mr. Ninisto, perhaps you want to have a last word for a young audience who was there today, and have a take-home message for them?
Well, I just have one message, and that's very clear. I think all kind of activism when it comes to the transformation to sustainable agriculture and food production is very much welcome, because it does have an effect. We wouldn't have Green Deal in this parliament with this commission if the young people, the climate activism, hadn't been on the street in the spring of 2019. At that momentum, just keep on doing it, and then we'll try to, change the system from within.
That was a really nice message to conclude. So thank you. So you, Mr. Ninisto, and all other MEPs for accepting to share with us your experience on agriculture and environmental matter, and for coming to this event to engage in discussion with young Europeans. And to our audience, thank you for attending this event and for asking your question in the chat. We didn't have the time to run to all the questions, and I'm very sorry about it. But thank you for sharing your suggestion and concerns. And as Mr. Ninisto say, keep on with your activism, because it's what really can move on. So we were Generation Climate Europe. Please follow us on our social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram. You can also subscribe to our newsletter and listen to our podcast to be aware of all news about environment, and keep on with your activism and with your engagement. And there will be a third and last session of European Parliament Youth Dialogue about climate justice. So I hope we can see you there. And thank you very much, everyone. Goodbye.